to take a few moments to talk about the poem Introduction to Poetry. In our book, it's on page 607. I'm going to go ahead and read this poem, and then I want to ask you a few questions, bring up a few points that I think you ought to consider. Introduction to Poetry. I ask them to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a color slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out, or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. But all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. Right? So, some things I want us to consider about this poem. First, let's kind of ask ourselves, what poetic devices stand out to us as being particularly significant? We might ask ourselves the most readily obvious question when it comes to poetry: does it rhyme? Right? And I'm not really sensing that we have a lot of rhyme, although you might want to consider the word light and slide in the first stanza. And just notice that right away. I probably would need to look at this in more detail to notice if there are any other similar sounding like vowels that are close to each other. But certainly sound is a feature we would want to take into account. So is there anything sound-wise that stands out to you right away? But then going back to more like basic questions you ask yourself when you are looking at a poem, like what is going on in this poem? What is happening? Notice that the title is Introduction to Poetry, right? Which, I don't know, that might conjure up something in your mind, something that, okay, I think I know maybe what the setting of this poem is, or what is happening in this poem just based on the title itself. But if we start looking at the specific stanzas, you have an I who's asking other people to do a certain thing, right? To I guess take a variety of approaches when it comes to looking at a poem. And so first, the speaker is asking them to hold a poem up to the light like a color slide. I don't know if you guys know what a color slide is. They used to be used very commonly to show images. I think you've seen probably like the carousel with all the slides, and then you click this little button and it clicks to a new slide and you project that on the screen. So that's what he's talking about. But if you've ever seen a color slide, then they're very, very tiny, and so the image that you're looking at is like really small, exceedingly small, but then of course when it's projected it's like large. So anyway, so he's asking them to take this poem and hold it up to the light so they can see more about this really small image that might not be very clear to them, right? Just trying to look at it without light. So that's what, like a visual like metaphor, right? He's comparing the poem to a color slide. And then in the next stanza, or press an ear against its hive. So what is the comparison that's being made in that stanza? What makes a hive, right? What might you hear if you press your ear to a hive, right? You're going to hear that droning, right? The droning sound of bees working, right? So he's comparing the poem to a hive of bees. And then the next stanza, I say drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out. So under what circumstances do we see mice being dropped into something and working their way out? I think the word we're looking for is maze, right? So he wants them to, sort of treat the poem as if it's an experiment, He's wanting them to sort of have this tactile experience of the poem. So if we go back and look at the first stanza deals with visual. And we might want to ask ourselves, who is the them? Who is they, right? I tend to think it's students, right? We also have the title Introduction to Poetry. It sounds like the title of a course. So I think we have an instructor, and he's describing what he wishes his students would do. Like this is how he wishes they would approach poetry. So the first stanza deals with visual, right? Getting a visual experience of that poem, and then the second stanza is like an oral, A-U-R-A-L, right? Oral experience of the poem. And then we have, or auditory, you could say either one. And then the third stanza is more like a tactile, like dropping a mouse into a maze and watching him sort of weave his way through, the mystery of the poem. And then the next stanza, or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. So I assume this room is dark, right? So the poem is being compared to a dark room, and students must walk in and kind of feel their way around, feel for that light switch, and then they find it and they can, flick on the light switch, and suddenly things become apparent to them that they didn't notice before or that they didn't understand, right? So that's also a metaphor, right? It's a tactile and a visual metaphor. So students are kind of feeling around to find something. What is the light switch a metaphor for? We might want to think about that. And then the next stanza, I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. So I guess this is visual, but it's also tactile. The experience of skimming, because if you're water skiing, you're on the surface, right? You're skimming across the surface of a body of water. You're not getting deep. It's not like you're scuba diving, okay? So you're skimming along on the surface, and that's kind of what he's suggesting. He wants them to water ski across the surface. He wants them to become familiar with it and experience it in that way. But he also wants them to look over and see, hey, there's somebody over here that I need to acknowledge who wrote this, right? So they're like waving at like, I see you, I know that you wrote this, I know you're over there. And then the next stanza, but all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with a rope and torture a confession out of it. So, I mean, how does what the teacher hopes that how do his hopes, I guess, align with what actually happens, right? So he has all these hopes for them, and these experiences seem positive, right? They seem just like based on curiosity. It's intriguing for them to kind of investigate the poem in this way. Nothing seems harsh about that. But then he says all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession out of it. Yeah, so it's like the students believe there's some critical piece of information that the poem is just not giving up, right? This poem is not cooperating with them. It's not revealing the truth to them in the way that they think it needs to. And so because of that, they're going to demand that the poem give up its secrets, right? And so that's how they go about it. They try to torture the truth out of the poem, the special hidden meaning out of the poem. And then the last stanza, they begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means, as if simple exploration and curiosity will not reveal that to them, right? It's like they don't trust their experience with the poem. They don't trust that poetry can be pleasurable. It's like they think it has to be a torturous situation. Poems hold on to their secrets, and you have to do special, almost magical things. In this case, you have to torture the truth out of them, right? You have to go to these great lengths to discover what a poem means. And his understanding is that you don't. You need to just experience the poem. And there are multiple ways of entering a poem. And that's what he's saying to them. There are different ways of doing that. You don't have to torture a confession out of the poem. You can trust that you will arrive at a poem's truth through these other means, right? So we know that this poem is heavily metaphorical, right? Heavily metaphorical. We can see the metaphors in each stanza. I definitely, if I'm looking at question 2 under these considerations for critical thinking and writing, how does the mood of the poem change beginning in line 12? Well, at first the mood is what, like sort of whimsical, lighthearted. It makes me feel that way, because remember, the mood is how something makes you feel, the reader. So it seems whimsical to me, lighthearted, and then it seems just like intellectually curious, And then we get to the part, I guess, line 12, but all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with rope. I don't know. He seems disheartened, right? That part seems disheartened, and I feel that coming from him. My take on mood there would be disappointed. I feel a disappointment there. A sort of grimness, Now, how do we figure out what tone is? So we have to think about the poem in its entirety, right? We have to take into account that here's an instructor, and he has all these high hopes for how his students are going to experience this poem, but we find that they don't do that. The students can't bring themselves to approach a poem with a sense of curiosity and wonder. A sense that a poem is, in a way, a natural thing. It isn't something that's an enemy to them, that's trying to make them feel stupid, right? So often students think that poems are so mysterious and so impossible to understand that it makes them feel dumb when they try to read poems, right? But ultimately, when we look at the entirety of this poem, there's a tone of, I would say, it is disappointment, That's probably the best word I could come up with. If I looked at my list of tone words, I could probably come up with other really accurate ones, sort of to describe that. But I am getting a sense of a disillusionment. Probably is a good word there. There's a tone of disillusionment about the whole, like throughout when I take the entirety of the poem into account. I get a sense of disillusionment from, I'm going to say, maybe the poet. Sometimes we have a tendency to conflate the speaker's voice and the poet's voice, in poetry. But I would say the tone I'm getting is one of disillusionment. All right. Other things we need to talk about. We might not bring up every aspect for every poem, but the ones that stand out to me in this poem are the use of metaphor, definitely the mood, the tone. The title is of particular importance because it really clues us in to who the people in the poem are. The I's, the instructor, the they or them belongs to the identity of the students. Probably in this poem as well, we want to think about stanza length and this visual structure that's going on in the poem. So notice the first stanza is made up of 3 lines. Then we have another stanza it's like, when I say stanza, I mean like groups of lines. Okay, groups of lines. So we have the first stanza made up of 3 lines. We have the next stanza, which appears to me to be 1 line. Okay, and then we have the next stanza, which is 2 lines. The next one, 2 lines. The next one is 3. The one after that is 3, and then the final one is 2. And I've had students say to me before that it really seems like each stanza is presenting us with a different sort of image or way of seeing the poem. And I think that's true because I mentioned before how the first stanza talks about like visually, the poem visually, and then the next one, deals with hearing, and then the one after that more tactile or sense of touch. But we're given sort of like different scenarios in which we can view this poem. So I think that works well. We might justify the organization of the stanzas according to how one might experience that poem. All right. I will say that we have some alliteration. I just noticed it in the final stanza. They begin beating it with the hose to find out what it really means. So begin beating, that's alliteration. If we look at the first stanza, we have light, slide, hive. So we have the long I, the repetition of that long I sound, which is assonance, right? Right. Let's see if there's anything else I want to say about this poem in particular. Okay, I think that's pretty much it. Notice, well, I will say one more thing about lineation or the creation of lines. The first stanza has no end stopping, right? So at the end of the line, you don't see any punctuation. So no end stopping there. However, in the second stanza, right after the word hive, you have a period. So we would call that line end stopped. END -STOPPED, end stopped. So in the first stanza, the lines just continue, with no punctuation to stop anything. That's called enjambment. Okay? I believe, at least this is my experience, that when you have lines that are enjambed, we tend to maybe read them a little more flowingly, fluidly. We think of the punctuation not being there as a cue to just keep going, right? And to not pause at all. So enjambment tends to, sort of, sometimes it can speed up how we read a poem, all right? But end stopping tends to create a little more of a pause. All right, so that is my discussion of Introduction to Poetry.